The first ping sounded like a fork touching crystal small and bright, easily lost in the rooftop noise, but the words that slid across Colin's unlocked phone were not the kind you can ignore. Detroit's skyline glittered behind the glass balustrade, music floated through heaters, and I was smiling at a colleague when the banner preview flashed. "Can't wait to taste you again tonight." Another ping followed, sly and breathless, mentioning the tie I had straightened on my husband 10 minutes earlier. I felt the world tilt, the room stretch like a hallway in a bad dream, and still the phone felt warm in my hand, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. I blinked hard, hoping I'd misread, but the little red hearts and the wink were merciless. Before I go further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if stories of quiet justice keep you company at night, tap like and subscribe, so these moments find you again when you need them most. My name is Mariah, and somewhere between the vows we wrote at 29 and the roof deck where we toasted year 7, I became the quiet machinery that kept our life looking perfect. I grew up in a small Midwestern town with parents who prized reliability over grand gestures, the kind of people who saved foil and paid off cars early. When I met Colin, he was all polished confidence and easy laughter. The sort of man who made waiters remember his order and bosses remember his name. I mistook that shine for substance. We married in a little church with cheap candles that smoked, moved to a stone front colonial outside Detroit, and told ourselves we were a team. The public part belonged to him. The invisible part, the lists and lunches and dentist appointments, belonged to me. The house was our pride, with high ceilings that made winter light look generous and a yard big enough for neighborhood soccer games, and I signed the down payment from the inheritance my mother left me like it was a blessing I was passing forward. After Ava was born, I told my boss I'd be back once daycare costs made sense, but years slipped by in carpools and casseroles, and my title became the person who could be counted on. We were not rich, not really, but Colin liked to play like we were brisk dinners, downtown cards that never said no jokes about being a 2-car garage kind of executive. I laughed along because families run on the oil of small concessions, and mine had always taught me to keep things smooth. It wasn't that there were no hairline cracks. I simply sanded them with excuses I believed because they were easier to live with. Late nights became work dinners, and work dinners became off-sites that never appeared on his calendar. The smell of cologne I didn't buy clung to suit jackets like a stranger's whisper. Once I found a hotel keycard in his blazer, and he shrugged, blamed a mix-up at a conference, kissed my forehead as if he could press certainty through skin. I swallowed doubt like medicine and told myself children deserve an unbroken picture frame, even if the photo inside has faded. On the rooftop that night, I wasn't looking for proof. I was balancing plates, making introductions, the quiet spouse who knows which donor likes the Malbec and which manager's wife gets cold. He pressed the phone into my hand, said, "Show him the design photos," and turned away to laugh with the men who had once toasted my cooking and called me the reason he gets to win. The message banners did not ask permission. They marched across the screen and made my ribs feel too tight for air. I tasted copper, realized I'd been biting my tongue, and understood with the simple cruelty clarity always brings that I had financed the stage on which he performed, then been asked to applaud from the wings. I straightened, felt the night air hit the damp at my temples, and saw the way a woman nearby had gone still, her eyes flicking from my face to the screen like she was watching a glass about to tip. Across the deck, Colin's laugh rang false to me for the first time, a sound with too many teeth, and our city glittered like a witness that would not intervene. I lifted the phone, and the music seemed to fade, and the last thought I had before I spoke was simple and absolute. If there must be a moment when the mask drops, let it be mine to choose. The rooftop air grew heavy as I raised Colin's phone higher, the bright screen cutting through the string lights and champagne laughter. My voice carried sharper than I intended, but the words broke free before I could stop them. Are you serious right now? Every conversation around us stopped, as though the city itself had gone quiet. Heads turned, glasses froze midair, and for the first time in years, Colin looked unsure of himself. He blinked across the space, still smiling like he hadn't caught up, and then saw the screen in my hand. The color drained from his face, his shoulders straightened, as if posture might hold the pieces together. "Mariah, give me the phone," he said, low and urgent, but I shook my head hard enough to make the earrings tug at my lobes. "No," I said, voice trembling, but steady enough to carry. "You've been sneaking around with her while smiling in my face, while our daughter sleeps under our roof while I carried every ounce of this family. And now you're foolish enough to hand me the evidence in front of everyone." A gasp moved through the crowd like a wind. Someone whispered his name. Another muttered, "Oh my God." And I watched Colin try to reach for me. His hand half extended, his voice stumbling with excuses. "It's not what it looks like," he started, but I laughed, a sound more bitter than I ever knew I could make. "It's exactly what it looks like," I said. And before I realized what my hand was doing, I hurled the glass I'd been holding not at him, but at the polished floor between us. The shattering rang out like a gunshot, sharp enough to make the nearest guests step back. For a moment, the only sound was the shards rolling beneath expensive shoes. "Congratulations," I hissed, leaning close enough for him to see every inch of fury on my face. "You've managed to destroy your marriage and your reputation in a single night." My heels clicked toward the elevator, each step heavier than the last, while his voice rose behind me, calling my name, trying to patch together what could not be mended. The doors closed on his panic, leaving me alone with my reflection in the mirrored wall. My mascara was streaked, my lips trembling, but my eyes looked like someone I barely knew. I whispered to that woman in the glass, "This isn't the end. You have no idea what I'm capable of." At my sister Renee's house, later that night, I sat curled on her couch with a blanket pulled tight, staring at my phone as it lit with missed calls. Colin's messages swung wildly between apologies and threats, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. Tessa arrived not long after, her eyes scanning my face before she even sat down. She confessed she had seen him weeks earlier, walking hand in hand with a woman who was not me. She had hesitated to tell me, not knowing how to break it. Her words landed heavier than any champagne glass because deep down I had already known. That night in Renee's dim living room, denial finally died. What I had suspected for years was no longer a shadow, it was fact. I thought back over the years, the times I'd silenced the alarms in my own head. The perfume that clung to his shirt after late nights at the office. The sudden expenses he brushed off as work-related. The hotel keycard I found in his jacket, which he laughed off with a story I wanted so badly to believe. I had kept quiet, patching walls I knew were crumbling because of Ava. She deserved stability, I told myself. She deserved a home where her parents shared the same roof, even if the foundation had already split. But now, sitting between my sister's steady presence and my best friend's painful honesty, I realized the roof had collapsed long before tonight. I had been the only one holding it up. When Ava stirred in the guest room and Renee carried her back to bed, I watched the small rise and fall of my daughter's shoulders, and the ache in my chest deepened. She had my eyes and his stubborn streak, and she would one day understand that her father had gambled with her world for the sake of whispers and late-night promises. I pressed my hand to the doorframe and promised myself she would never again be asked to live inside a lie. By morning, my eyes were swollen, and the ache in my head was pounding, but something inside me had shifted. The missed calls had multiplied voicemails stacked like stones, and then a single text that told me everything I needed to know. Please don't ruin this for us. We can fix it. Us. Not me. Not our family. Not our daughter. Us, meaning him and her. The word twisted my stomach and hardened my resolve. He wasn't sorry. He was terrified. Terrified of losing the image he'd built, terrified of being exposed, terrified of what I might do now that the truth had spilled into the open. I sat at Renee's kitchen table, my fingers wrapped around a mug that had gone cold, and I made my first decision in months that felt like my own. I would no longer live inside his story. I logged into our accounts, hands shaking, as I transferred what was legally mine into a secure account under my name only. Years of managing bills and balances meant I knew every password, every line item, every withdrawal. Within minutes, the account he loved to flash at restaurants was locked tight. My mother's inheritance, the house and the life I had built around him, would no longer be his stage. The rest of the morning moved like a slow march. I searched for the best family attorney I could find, scheduled a consultation, and explained everything in a voice steadier than I expected. Andrea Cho listened quietly, then told me the words I hadn't realized I needed. You have more leverage than you think. For the first time, I felt the ground shift back beneath my feet. Later, I called a realtor I trusted, starting the quiet process of protecting what I had poured my mother's sacrifice into. By noon, I had a battle plan, not just a broken heart. That afternoon, Colin showed up at Renee's door. He knocked hard enough that the neighbors peeked through their blinds, but I stayed upstairs, watching through the window as he paced the porch with his phone glued to his ear. I imagined him calling banks trying to understand why his cards weren't working, his voice rising with panic. I almost smiled, but my chest still burned too much to let it last. Later, when Ava was tucked into bed and I was folding her pajamas into neat squares, the phone rang again. Against my better judgment, I answered. Mariah, please, he said, his voice low and tight. This has gotten out of hand. We can talk like adults. I love you. Don't do this to our family. His words scraped like sandpaper. Our family, I repeated softly. The same family you risked in hotel rooms and text messages. You already did this. I'm just making sure the ashes don't bury me and Ava. There was silence, then the sharp edge of his anger broke through. You can't just take everything. The accounts, the house. None of that is just yours. I steadied my breath. But it is, and I have the proof. Watch me. Then I hung up. That night, I lay awake in Renee's guest room, not because the pain had vanished, it hadn't, but because I finally had direction. For months, I had been drifting, patching walls that were already broken, trying to preserve a picture that no longer existed. Now, for the first time, I was steering. I whispered into the dark, not for him, but for myself. He would not see me coming. And with that vow, the storm inside me shifted. He thought he was still the one holding the reins, but he had no idea that I had already begun to take back the life he had stolen piece by piece. The quiet after my phone call with Colin didn't feel like peace. It felt like standing in the middle of a storm's eye, the silence almost mocking, as if daring me to believe it was finished. I knew better. Every message, every excuse, every denial had already carved deep grooves into me, and no amount of silence could smooth them out. I had been holding myself together with invisible string for so long that even now, after taking my first steps to protect myself, I felt frayed to the point of snapping. At Renee's house, the days blurred into a rhythm of borrowed coffee mugs, whispered conversations in the hallway, and Ava's laughter trying to cut through the heaviness she didn't fully understand. At night, when the house went quiet, I lay awake listening to the furnace kick on and off, trying not to let the ache of betrayal swell so loudly it shook me. I thought of all the times I had smiled through exhaustion, telling myself that supporting Colin was worth it, that keeping the family whole mattered more than my own voice. Now those sacrifices, once worn like quiet badges of honor, felt like chains I had willingly wrapped around myself. I remembered the early years with Colin, when I believed we were partners in the truest sense. He had been magnetic back then, with a confidence that drew people in, like moths to a flame. I had matched his stride, building my career in marketing, while he climbed through the automotive industry. We were ambitious young and convinced we'd build something extraordinary together. When Ava was born, I stepped back from my job, telling myself it was temporary. Temporary turned into years, and while he collected praise for being a devoted husband and father, I became the invisible machinery that made his performance possible. Every bill paid on time, every school form signed, every meal planned, I was the one holding it together while he took the credit. The inheritance from my mother had been the foundation of our home, a truth he liked to minimize with offhand jokes about our investment. I hadn't minded back then, not really. I thought of it as building a life we both wanted. But sitting in Renee's guest room, I could see how it had been used as a stage for him to shine, while I stood in the wings clapping until my hands hurt. The realization stung worse than the texts. My mother's sacrifice had built a house that now reeked of lies. Some days guilt pressed against me like a weight. I wondered if I had been blind or worse, complicit in letting him take piece after piece of me without protest. I had smelled perfume that wasn't mine on his clothes. I had found receipts for dinners I hadn't been invited to. Each time he had offered just enough charm or explanation to ease the sting, and I had swallowed my doubts because believing him felt safer than tearing everything apart. I wanted Ava to grow up in a home where her parents smiled at each other across the table, not one split in two. I told myself stability was the greatest gift I could give her. Now I saw it for what it was, a lie wrapped in good intentions. Tessa sat across from me one evening, with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her eyes steady but full of regret. She told me again that she had seen Colin with another woman weeks before, holding hands in a way that wasn't casual. She hadn't known how to tell me, hadn't wanted to shatter my world. Hearing her say it aloud was both a knife and a balm. It cut deep because it was confirmation, but it also soothed something in me that had felt isolated. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined the distance, the lies, the small humiliations. It was real, and someone else had seen it. Ava too sensed more than I wanted her to. Children always do. She asked me one night why I was sleeping at Aunt Renee's house, and why Daddy hadn't come to kiss her goodnight. I smoothed her hair back and told her we just needed some time, that everything would be okay. My voice cracked on the last word, and I hoped she didn't hear it. Later, I sat in the hallway outside her room, knees pulled to my chest, crying into my hands so quietly the furnace's hum could cover me. I wasn't just mourning a marriage. I was mourning the years I had given the pieces of myself. I had lost the trust I had carried like something sacred, only to watch it trampled. In those quiet hours, I began to see how much I had allowed myself to disappear. My world had shrunk to fit around Colin's. I had dressed for his colleagues' parties, hosted dinners for his clients, laughed at jokes I didn't find funny just to keep the room smooth. Somewhere in the process, Mariah, the woman with ambition and drive, and her own ideas, had slipped beneath the surface. I thought of her now like a ghost I had once known. The betrayal forced me to look her in the eye, and it hurt almost as much as Colin's infidelity. When Douglas, my father-in-law, called late one evening, his voice was strained. "Mariah, what's happening between you two?" "People are talking." I paused, the silence stretching long enough to tell him what he already suspected. "Ask your son," I said simply. He sighed, and then softer admitted, "I always told him you were the best thing that ever happened to him. If he's thrown that away, he'll have to live with it." It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement, and that meant more than I expected. Even his father knew the truth now. Still, every step forward came with an echo of pain. When I brushed my teeth at Renee's bathroom sink, I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes were rimmed red, her shoulders hunched as if bracing for another blow. When I tucked Ava in at night, I watched her small hands clutch the blanket and thought of the childhood I had wanted to preserve for her now shattered. When I lay down at night, the silence pressed against my ears until I thought I would scream. Betrayal wasn't just a wound. It was a constant ache, a whisper that followed me everywhere. But even in that ache, something steady began to take root. I was no longer asking myself, why me? The question had shifted to what now? And that shift, subtle as it was, gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time direction. I could no longer erase the years of sacrifice or the humiliation of his betrayal, but I could reclaim what was mine. And I could make sure that Ava's future wasn't tied to the choices of a man who had gambled so recklessly with our lives. I didn't know yet how far the consequences would reach, or how quickly his carefully polished image would begin to crumble. But in those first weeks, as the weight of what he had done pressed down on me, I began to understand that the pain I carried was also fuel. Every tear, every sleepless night, every pang of regret was sharpening me in ways I hadn't expected. Colin believed he had broken me. What he didn't realize was that the cracks he left were only making room for something stronger to emerge. And as I lay awake one night, with the sound of Ava's breathing steady down the hall, I made a promise to myself that I whispered into the dark. This wouldn't end with me buried beneath his lies. This was only the beginning, and he wouldn't see me coming. The morning after Renee found me sitting awake in her kitchen with cold coffee, I realized I could no longer afford to drift between anger and grief. The weight of betrayal was still heavy, but beneath it, something else stirred, something sharper than sorrow. For years, I had patched walls, silenced alarms, and kept the peace. That morning, I chose not to patch anymore. I would build something new piece by piece, even if it meant tearing down the house of cards Colin had constructed around us. The first step was money. I logged back into our accounts with a steadiness I hadn't expected, moving funds into an account solely under my name, ensuring that what I had left would be safe. My hands shook, but the act itself brought clarity. Colin had leaned on my trust for years, assuming I would never separate myself from the system we shared. In minutes, that illusion was gone. For the first time, I felt like I was steering my own life instead of being carried along in his wake. The second step was the house. I called Glenn Harper, a realtor I had known since before Colin and I married. He remembered my mother, remembered the day I'd signed the down payment check from her inheritance. His voice was calm, professional, but I could hear the surprise when I told him I wanted to quietly begin the process of transferring everything into my own name. "Mariah, you have more leverage than you realize," he said, gently echoing Andrea's words from days before. It steadied me knowing that I wasn't walking blind. At night, when Ava was asleep and the house was quiet, I let the tears come, but even then, I noticed a change. They were no longer just tears of despair. They were cleansing, like the storm had passed and left me with clear skies I wasn't used to. I thought of my mother often during those nights. She had worked her whole life to leave me something solid, and now I was finally protecting it the way she would have wanted. In some strange way, she felt closer to me than she had in years. Colin, meanwhile, grew more desperate. His calls came at all hours, his messages swinging from pleading to accusing. One evening, he showed up again at Renee's house, this time with flowers clutched in his hand and a rehearsed smile. Ava was watching television in the living room, so I stepped outside to meet him on the porch. He thrust the bouquet toward me as if it could erase everything. "Let's not make this ugly," he said. "We can fix this." I stared at the man who had promised me forever, who had turned my life into a stage for his ambition. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk," I told him quietly. This was a choice over and over again. His jaw tightened, the mask slipping just enough for me to see the anger beneath. When he tried to mention our daughter, I pressed the flowers back into his chest so hard petals scattered across the porch. "Don't you dare use her to shield yourself," I said. "She deserves better." After that night, something inside me hardened. His attempts to manipulate me only strengthened my resolve. Each day, I felt less like a victim and more like a strategist. I moved through Renee's house with a sense of purpose, checking lists, taking calls, meeting with Andrea to map out the next steps. Ava noticed too. She clung to me more in those days, sensing the shift, and I promised her with every hug that we would be okay. I didn't tell her the details, but she could see it in the way I carried myself. The fear that had weighed on me was giving way to something steadier. Rumors about Colin began to circulate faster than I expected. Tessa told me she had heard from friends at his office that whispers were spreading after the rooftop disaster. His boss had already pulled him aside, concerned less with performance and more with appearances. In a city like Detroit, reputation travels faster than traffic. Colleagues who once admired him now kept their distance, and I knew that soon the story would spill into circles he couldn't control. The thought didn't bring me joy exactly, but it brought balance. For years, I had lived in his shadow, unseen and unacknowledged. Now the truth was stepping into the light. Through all of it, I kept my movements quiet but deliberate. I didn't scream, I didn't chase, I didn't even answer most of his calls. Silence became my weapon, forcing him to confront a world where his usual charm no longer worked. He thrived on control, on spinning stories that suited him. Now, without my compliance, he had no narrative left to hide behind. Watching that realization dawn on him, even from a distance, was a kind of vindication I hadn't known I needed. There were nights when doubt crept back in, when I wondered if I had the strength to see it through. Divorce wasn't just a word, it was a dismantling of everything I had built, even if much of it had been built on lies. But then I would think of Ava, her wide eyes looking to me for steadiness, and I knew I couldn't falter. This wasn't just about punishing Colin. It was about reclaiming myself, about showing my daughter that strength doesn't always come from holding on. It often comes from letting go. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in Renee's living room, Ava asked quietly, "Mom, are we going home soon?" I knelt beside her, smoothing her hair back, and said, "We're building a new home, sweetheart. One where we'll both feel safe." She nodded, not fully understanding, but her small smile told me she believed me. That smile carried me through the rest of the day, fueling me more than any court filing or financial maneuver ever could. The clarity I felt grew stronger each day. Colin thought I would stay silent, that I would let him twist the story and continue shining in front of others, while I disappeared into the background. He was wrong. I had been invisible long enough. Now, with every step, I was carving a path that was mine alone. And while he scrambled to regain control, I was already moving toward a life where his shadow no longer touched me. I didn't yet know how public the unraveling would become, or how far his fall would spread beyond our family. But I could feel it coming like the low rumble of thunder before the storm breaks. And I knew deep down that when it did, I would be ready to stand tall in the open air. The weeks that followed moved with a strange rhythm. Colin tried everything to regain control: calls that came in waves, unexpected visits at Renee's door, even half-hearted apologies delivered with bouquets I left to wither in the trash. Each attempt revealed more of his desperation, and though the ache of betrayal lingered, I felt myself steadying with every passing day. The fear that once kept me silent was gone. I had begun to see myself not as the woman left behind, but as the one holding the quiet reins of change. It started small, with the way I carried myself in public. Detroit is not a city where reputations stay hidden for long. Word of the rooftop humiliation had spread, and I knew eyes followed me when I walked into the grocery store or stopped by Ava's school. I refused to shrink. I straightened my shoulders, returned every glance, and let the silence between us say what words could not. People whispered, but they also watched, and I understood the power in being seen as unbroken. Colin, meanwhile, leaned into performance. Tessa called one afternoon to say she had heard from a friend that he was showing up at familiar restaurants with the other woman on his arm. Not in secrecy anymore, but in full view, as if parading her presence could rewrite the narrative. It didn't sting the way I thought it might. Instead, it confirmed what I already knew: he needed to be seen, needed to cling to the image of a man still in control. I decided then that I would give him a stage he couldn't manage. When Tessa suggested dinner at Prime Plus Proper, a place we both knew Colin favored, I agreed without hesitation. I chose my outfit with care that evening, not for him, but for myself. Dark dress hair pulled back, makeup understated, but deliberate. The moment we stepped inside, I saw him across the room at a corner table. He hadn't changed his habits. He still chose places where being noticed mattered more than privacy. The woman beside him was younger, with a laugh pitched too high, her hand clinging to his arm as though possession could disguise insecurity. For a moment, he didn't see me, but when his gaze lifted and locked with mine, the color drained from his face. I could have walked past, could have let silence punish him more than words, but I had grown tired of letting silence do all the work. I crossed the room with steady steps, aware of conversations faltering around us, forks pausing midair. "Funny seeing you here," I said evenly, letting my eyes rest on him, not her. His throat tightened, and he cleared it with forced calm. "Mariah, we're just having dinner. There's no need to cause a scene." I leaned closer, voice sharp but quiet enough to carry. "You caused the scene when you shoved your phone into my hand and let her words spill across it." The woman shifted in her seat, her gaze darting to the tablecloth, and I didn't spare her more than a glance. From my bag, I pulled the envelope I had carried for days, its weight both dreaded and necessary. I placed it carefully between their wine glasses. Colin's face went rigid as he picked it up, his hands tightening around the edges. "What's this?" he asked, though he already knew. "Divorce papers," I answered. "Read them later. For now, here's the short version: the house, the account's custody of Ava, they're mine. You can keep what's left sitting across from you." Gasps moved through nearby tables, the kind of whispers that carry farther than shouts. His expression twisted, torn between anger and disbelief, and I held his gaze without flinching. "You think this makes you look strong?" he hissed. I tilted my head. "I don't need to think. Look around. Everyone already knows." He reached for his glass, his composure slipping as whispers filled the space. I set it gently back down before he could drink, meeting his eyes one last time. Get used to drinking alone. With that, I turned and walked toward the exit, my heels clicking against the floor, each step louder than the last. Behind me, the restaurant buzzed with hushed conversation, a moment already weaving itself into the city's gossip. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. By morning, I heard from Tessa that the story had already traveled. A friend at Colin's office mentioned whispers at the water cooler, glances that lingered too long, and a supervisor quietly calling him aside. In Detroit, reputation is currency, and his was quickly being devalued. I knew then that the public unraveling had only begun. Colin's response was predictable. A carefully worded post appeared on social media framing our marriage as if we were weathering a rough season together, asking for privacy during a difficult time. The words were hollow, but his performance was meant for colleagues and acquaintances who hadn't been at the rooftop party or the steakhouse. He still believed he could control the story. What he didn't realize was that whispers had already grown into something larger. A local business blog published an article hinting at trouble, rumors of personal scandals, questions about his professionalism, even speculation that his position at the company was at risk. By the weekend, the article had been picked up by others, and I began receiving messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, their words laced with quiet support and disbelief at his carelessness. It spread faster than either of us could have expected. Screenshots of messages I had once buried on my phone surfaced online, passed along by people who claimed to have heard the story firsthand. Strangers began mocking him openly, turning his arrogance into a punchline. A hashtag appeared small at first, then swelling until it trended across the city. Each time I scrolled, I saw his name attached to ridicule his downfall, dissected in comments and captions. And for once, I didn't have to raise my voice. The truth was doing the work for me. Colin fought back in the only way he knew. He gave a local radio interview, his voice dripping with feigned composure. He admitted to mistakes, but framed me as unstable, someone exaggerating for attention. It was his final attempt to seize control, but within hours, more evidence surfaced. Emails, vulgar and undeniable, written from his work account during office hours, leaked from someone inside his circle. His company suspended him immediately, citing conduct unbecoming, though everyone knew the suspension was just a formality before dismissal. The mistress, too, began to feel the weight of his collapse. Her name, once hidden in text threads, surfaced in whispers and online posts. She locked her accounts within days, retreating from the same attention she once craved. I almost pitied her, but not enough to forget she had known exactly what she was stepping into. Colin's money, his influence, his shine. It had all dimmed, and with it, her patience. Meanwhile, my phone filled with messages from women I didn't know. Women who had followed the story as it spread. "Stay strong," they wrote. "We're rooting for you." Their words didn't fix the years of sacrifice, but they reminded me that I was no longer invisible. For the first time in a long time, people saw me not as Colin's wife, but as someone who refused to be erased. Late one evening, sitting on Renee's couch with a glass of wine, I watched Colin's last desperate move unfold. A live video streamed across his profile. His tie crooked, his eyes wild as he spoke about forgiveness and family. The comments flooded faster than his words, tearing him apart in real time. Log off. Forgiveness. After those messages, he ended the video abruptly, but the damage was already done. His mask was shattered. His reputation, once untouchable, had collapsed under its own weight. I leaned back against the cushions, the glass cool in my hand. Ava asleep upstairs, and let myself breathe. For the first time since the rooftop, I felt peace. Not because everything was over, but because the tide had finally turned. He had spent years building an image, and I had spent years supporting it. Now, with nothing more than his own actions, it had all come crashing down. The storm had only just begun, but for the first time, I was no longer drowning. I was watching the water rise around him instead. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant, the kind of scent that lingers in spaces where too many lives have been unraveled and rewritten. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands resting flat on the polished wood, while Colin took his seat across the aisle. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. His suit hung looser than it had weeks ago, his face shadowed with exhaustion, his shoulders drawn in as though the weight of the room pressed directly on him. This was not the man who had once strode into every space, believing he owned it. This was someone stripped of control, and he knew it. Andrea leaned close, her tone steady but clipped. "Stay calm. Let the evidence do the work." I nodded, though my chest felt heavy, my heart drumming too loudly for comfort. When the judge entered, we rose. Honorable Samuel Price settled behind the bench, his expression unreadable, the kind of face that had seen hundreds of marriages collapse under the strain of pride and betrayal. His voice carried through the chamber with practiced authority, laying out the purpose of the hearing: property division, custody, financial support. It sounded clinical, but for me, it was the culmination of years of sacrifice now laid bare. Andrea began, with precision, laying out each piece of evidence in order. The texts, the emails, the late-night expenses, and finally the documents proving my inheritance had funded our home. Colin tried to interrupt, muttering about marital assets, about shared contributions, but the judge cut him off swiftly. "You'll have your turn," Judge Price said, his tone leaving no room for defiance. I sat still, my hands clasped together in my lap, every piece of proof like a stone placed carefully on the scale. When custody came up, my breath caught. This was the part that mattered most to me. Andrea outlined his reckless spending, the instability of his behavior, the public spectacle he had made of himself. She asked for full custody, with visitation only under supervision until he could prove stability. Colin's jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a thin line. He tried to speak about being a devoted father, about bedtime stories and weekend soccer. But even as he spoke, his voice wavered. The judge listened, but his eyes betrayed little sympathy. Ava's best interest was the priority, and the record of Colin's choices told its own story. The financial dismantling felt almost surgical. Andrea presented bank records, transfers, receipts, each one confirming that I had secured what rightfully belonged to me. The house purchased with my mother's inheritance was documented beyond dispute. Glenn had even provided a signed statement confirming the down payment had come directly from me. Colin's lawyer attempted to challenge it, but the evidence was irrefutable. Each rebuttal sounded weaker than the last, a man grasping at straws while the walls of his defense collapsed. The suspension from his company had already rattled him, but once the court filings became public record, the collapse accelerated. Within a week, he was officially dismissed, conduct unbecoming of an executive, the statement read. Detroit's business circles, small as they truly are, turned cold. Colleagues who once toasted him now distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with his disgrace. Even Douglas, who had bailed him out more times than I cared to count, called me late one evening. His voice was tight, bitter. "I raised him better than this," he said. "If you need anything legal, financial, you have my support." Not his. Those words struck harder than any ruling. His safety net was gone. The one person he had always relied on to smooth the damage had stepped away. The mistress had vanished as quickly as she appeared. She stopped showing up in public with him, stopped answering his calls, moved on to someone else with less baggage and a thicker wallet. I heard through whispers that she left without so much as a goodbye. The silence she left behind was louder than any confrontation could have been. He was alone, abandoned even by the person he had risked everything for. By the third month of proceedings, his decline was visible. He arrived late to hearings, unshaven, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear while he stared at the table. He tried to paint me as vindictive, claiming I was tearing him down out of spite, but the evidence silenced him. Every piece of proof was a nail in the coffin of that story. When the final ruling came, it was delivered with a clarity that left no doubt. Custody mine, the house mine, accounts mine. He was left with little more than personal belongings, a used car, and the fractured remains of his reputation. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, sunlight spread across the steps, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight on my chest loosen. Ava's small hand rested in mine. Her fingers warm, her trust intact. For once, I wasn't walking out as the silent partner, the woman behind the man. I was walking out as myself, steady, clear, and free. The weeks that followed showed me just how far he had fallen. He moved into a small rental apartment on the edge of the city, the kind of place where paint peeled from the walls and the plumbing groaned through the night. Friends stopped returning his calls. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid him, and his name, once spoken with admiration, became a cautionary whisper. I didn't need to witness it firsthand. The city carried the news to me, each story confirming what I already knew. He had become irrelevant. The last time I saw him inside the courthouse, his eyes searched mine with something close to pleading. He looked hollow, worn down, desperate for the mercy I no longer carried. I met his gaze, but I offered nothing. He had burned through every chance, squandered every ounce of trust. There was no mercy left. He was an architect staring at the ruins of his own design, and I would not rebuild it for him. Yet when I stepped into the cool air outside, I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was release. The chains of his lies, his debts, his betrayals gone. My life was no longer tethered to his decisions. And though grief lingered in quiet corners, freedom tasted steadier than I had ever imagined. I knew it wasn't the end of the story. There would be encounters still to come, moments where his desperation would try to claw its way back into my life. But for now, I held Ava's hand, let the sunlight warm my face, and walked forward with a dignity no ruling could ever take away. Late that autumn, Detroit carried a chill that seeped through every crack, the kind that made the city look tired and gray. I had just signed the final set of divorce documents when I saw him outside the courthouse. Colin stood near the steps, shoulders hunched against the wind, clutching a folder of papers as though it might anchor him. His coat was too thin for the weather, his hair unkempt, his face drawn. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize the man who once commanded every room with arrogance. He looked like a shadow of that man hollowed out by choices he could no longer control. "Mariah," he called softly when he spotted me. I kept walking, Ava's hand steady in mine, but he stepped into my path. "Please, just a minute." I tightened my scarf and sighed my patience thin. "What do you want, Colin?" His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed, his voice trembling. "I don't know where else to turn. You've taken everything. The house, the money, custody. Even my father won't return my calls. I'm drowning." His eyes glistened, but I saw no truth in them, only desperation. I looked at him, really looked, and felt the ache of recognition. This was the man who had once kissed me in hospital corridors after Ava was born, the man I had trusted with every piece of myself. But he was also the man who had betrayed me without hesitation, who had humiliated me in front of the people I once called family. Both men lived inside him, and only one had won. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a photograph of Ava smiling at her school recital. His hands shook as he held it up. "I miss her. I miss us. I miss you." My chest tightened, but not with longing. I met his eyes and spoke quietly, evenly. "You don't miss me. You miss the version of me who cleaned up your messes and made your life easy. That woman doesn't exist anymore." His face flinched as though I had struck him. "I made mistakes," he whispered. My voice sharpened. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is saying something cruel in anger. What you did was deliberate, over and over again. Don't you dare call that a mistake." He dropped his gaze, lips trembling. "I thought I was untouchable. I thought you'd never leave." There it was, the confession buried beneath all his excuses. I shook my head slowly. "I loved you, Colin. God help me, I did. I gave you years of my life, my mother's inheritance, my body, my trust, and you repaid it with humiliation and lies." He reached out as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back. "Your apologies mean nothing now. You had chance after chance to be the man you pretended to be. You failed me. You failed Ava. And you failed yourself." For a long moment, the wind was the only sound between us, tugging at the edges of our coats. Finally, I stepped closer, lowering my voice until it was sharp as glass. "You want the truth. You are the architect of your own destruction. Every brick in the ruins of your life, you laid them yourself." His face crumpled, shame and desperation colliding, but I didn't offer him the dignity of comfort. I turned, my heels clicking against the concrete, and walked away without looking back. Ava's hand was steady in mine, and I felt the weight of the past finally loosening its grip. Months passed, and whispers about him faded from the city's conversations. He became a ghost in the places we once moved through together. His apartment was small, his work prospects slim, his circle gone. Even the woman he had risked everything for had vanished, leaving him behind as easily as she had entered. People no longer spoke his name with admiration. When it did surface, it was in pity, a cautionary tale of a man who believed himself untouchable until he collapsed under the weight of his own arrogance. Meanwhile, my world slowly took shape again. Ava and I moved into a modest home that felt like ours, not a showroom for Colin's ego, but a place filled with warmth and laughter. I returned to work not because I needed to prove anything, but because it was a part of me I had missed. Clients valued me for my ideas, not for my husband's title. For the first time in years, I stood in my own light. Some mornings, as I sipped coffee on the porch and watched the skyline glow at sunrise, I felt a peace I hadn't known since before my marriage. Freedom wasn't loud or triumphant. It was steady, like breathing clean air after being shut inside too long. Ava noticed the change too. One evening, as we brushed our teeth side by side, she caught my eyes in the mirror. "Mom," she said quietly, "you smile more now." Her words nearly broke me, because children always see the truth. She had carried the tension of our home as much as I had, and now she was lighter. We both were. In that moment, I understood that the battle I had fought wasn't just for myself. It was for her future, for the kind of life she deserved, free from the shadow of betrayal. I didn't waste energy on hatred anymore. Hate ties you to someone as much as love does, and Colin didn't deserve that power. What I felt now was nothing, a hollow space where he used to matter, replaced by the certainty that I had survived, rebuilt, and thrived. His downfall wasn't my triumph. My life was. And in that truth, I found a dignity he could never take away. But even then, I knew the story wasn't fully complete. Justice had been served, yes, and dignity restored. But I still had one final step to take. The quiet reflection that would allow me to close this chapter for good. The seasons turned, and life began to settle into something I hadn't felt in years, steady calm and mine. The house Ava and I moved into was modest compared to the one I had once shared with Colin, but it carried a warmth that mansion never did. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows in the morning, soft and forgiving, and the walls slowly filled with drawings, laughter, and the quiet hum of a home at peace. For the first time, I felt no need to impress anyone who stepped through the door. It was ours, and that was enough. My days began to take shape again. I returned to the work I had once loved, this time without apology or guilt. Clients respected me not for the role I played as someone's wife, but for the ideas I brought, the clarity I carried. Each project reminded me of who I had been before I disappeared into Colin's ambitions, and each success felt like a stitch mending what had once been torn. It wasn't about proving myself to anyone else anymore. It was about reclaiming myself. Ava thrived in ways I hadn't expected. She decorated her new room with stars on the ceiling, the same way she had wanted for years, and filled her desk with storybooks and art supplies. She laughed more freely, slept more soundly, and no longer glanced over her shoulder when the phone rang or the doorbell chimed. One night, as we washed dishes side by side, she looked up at me and said, "Mom, our house feels happy." Those words lingered in my chest longer than any court ruling or settlement ever could. She had carried the tension just as I had, and now she was lighter. Colin's name still surfaced from time to time, but the edge of it had dulled. People mentioned him less and less, and when they did, it was with pity rather than admiration. He had become what he feared most: forgettable. The woman he gambled everything for had long since moved on. His colleagues had cut ties, and even his own family had stepped back. I no longer felt the pull of anger when I heard about his decline. Instead, I felt nothing, and in that nothingness, I discovered freedom. Hate would have tied me to him just as tightly as love once did, and I had no intention of carrying that burden anymore. In quiet moments, I sometimes thought of my mother, of the inheritance she left me, and how it had been misused for years. But instead of bitterness, I felt gratitude. Her gift had carried me through the storm and became the foundation of the life I was now building. I like to believe she would be proud, not just that I had reclaimed what was mine, but that I had chosen dignity over destruction, resilience over revenge. Justice had been served in ways both public and private, but more than that, peace had finally found me. Looking back, I realized betrayal had nearly broken me, but it also forged me into someone stronger. I once thought survival meant holding my marriage together, no matter how much it cost. Now I know survival sometimes means letting the fire burn, walking through the ashes, and choosing yourself. It isn't easy and it isn't quick, but it is possible. And when you reach the other side, the air feels cleaner, the ground steadier, and the smile in your child's eyes tells you it was worth it. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments if you'd like, and may these stories remind us all that dignity once reclaimed can never be taken again.